Championship Candidates tournament. We are closing in here towards the end of the tournament. We can see that Katask is winning, and he will face the reigning champion Yasugi99 later this year. The match tonight is between VariantsOnly and mariorton, two players at the bottom of the standings, but two very experienced and strong players who will undoubtedly play 10 very interesting Crazy House games. And I can see that the players are seated. VariantsOnly having a slight lead in their mutual games. And he's the slight favorite, being the high rated player by about 100 points. mariorton likes to play the king side fianchetto in the d4, d5 opening. Let's see what VariantsOnly has prepared for this. So black hasn't castled yet. Which makes defending c6 a bit awkward. Usually you want to castle and then maybe play queen e8, covering some light squares if or when white takes on c6. This is a bit more passive. This pin is annoying for white though. How do you free yourself? You might want to push the e pawn, but now it's not possible. So white just continues to develop his pieces, and black will probably catch up, just castle short. And then maybe start putting pieces, rook on the b file. Well, I could have considered just grabbing a pawn and then placing it on e5. Making it a pseudo sacrifice. So white is having a slight space advantage here. Probably the slightly preferable position. But that didn't look like the right way to go, did it? Opening the e file for the rook was a slightly strange decision, I would say. Going back looks natural. Vacating the e6 square. So white has his pieces on the first 4 ranks and black has the other 4 ranks. So after 25 moves, neither player has crossed the 4th rank. other than temporarily. So at the moment, black has a slight material lead. Strong move here with the rook of the 7th, but looks like black can defend. If you take here, you can play bishop b6, and then the f pawn is pinned, so you can grab the pawn on g3. And even though this bishop in the corner is very passive, it protects the g8 square, so the black king can hide in the corner. So a couple of strong threats here. Threatening the rook, threatening to take g3. Welcome those of you who are watching. So a very natural continuation here would be simply to take on g2. You don't want to allow queen f7 check followed by queen takes g7 though. But maybe take there, check on h4 and pick up rook. Oh, this is just mate. Black won very easily there in the end. White falling for a cheap trick with the queen takes g3 idea. This is also a specialty by mariorton, but letting the queen enter the game so early and putting it on a5 is probably a very dubious idea, I would say. Having the knight here on g4 looks aggressive, but actually I always feel pleased when my opponent puts his knight here, because then you can castle safely. This knight sort of shields the white king. You would prefer to have a bishop here on the diagonal. Where is this knight going? Everywhere there are protected pawns. So white decides it's time to open up the game. He's ahead in development. And if black takes here, white can take with the knight because the bishop on b5 is indirectly protected by knight takes c7 followed by knight takes b5. So white picks up a piece and gives the queen for a very strong attack now. Well, after knight at e5, the king is not going back. King d6, you simply play bishop at a3, winning the queen. That's another way of picking up the queen. The fork is coming. So, not so impressive play here by Black who will get mated in a couple of moves here. 2-0 variants only. Who made mariorton's opening look rather silly, I would say. This time variants only counters the white kingside fianchetto with fianchetto of his own. And interestingly, mariorton puts his pawn on d3 instead of d4. Although it seems like black is enjoying a healthy space advantage here. So this move is restricting the knight here. If white plays knight c4, you could just take it. This is opening up the diagonal, and this is a very passive pawn placement. Black is already better here with a pawn in hand, which he can place on the king side, and that is where the action is going to happen. So this looks a bit premature, but black is simply enjoying a slight space advantage. Maybe black is looking to take on d3 here, exchanging a piece for 2 pawns. Black would certainly be happy to trade this little defender. And white simply blundered a pawn here on d3. With so many pieces on the dark squares, black can start putting pieces on the light squares, quite unopposed. So very nice advantage here for black. And actually, let's say knight f4, you can take on f1, because if you take here, you have rook h2 and knight e2 check. And black decides he can take on f1 now as well. But what about bishop takes d3? Well, if bishop takes d3, maybe you take on g3 and fork on f2, or I'm not sure what the idea is. Seems a bit unnecessary. And I would certainly play king h2 instead of this. Why give the queen for free? More or less. And now you have bishop f4 with a double threat on the rook and mate on h2. Also covering h6, making black even more safe. And white simply resigned. And we see mariorton repeating his opening, which was a complete disaster. Instead of putting the queen on a5, he decides to retreat to d8. A bit more passive, but also more solid. So of course it's the queen is active and there are some tactical tricks, but also it's a very useful target for the white pieces to gain an initiative. So the queen ended up on a5 anyway. It does threaten the e5 pawn, so white needs to be careful about stuff like pawn g4. And I'm wondering how do you counter d5? You can take on e5, but simply giving the queen then looks very strong. So white takes care of this pin, securing his position a little bit and developing the dark square bishop, putting a lot of pressure here on black. Black has a very cramped position, and what white shouldn't do here is start trading on, let's say, on d8. That just helps black. Instead he should make use of the fact that the black pieces are so tangled up, suffocating the black king. So if black takes on d2, you have knight takes c7 mate, and now queen takes d7 is a nasty threat. Both players have spent all their pieces in hand. I expect bishop e6. And now a very aggressive queen sacrifice here by VariantsOnly. So opening d7 for a pawn check, actually pawn check mate. And I don't think black has anything after queen takes f1. I don't see a follow-up. Because white has a lot of protection here. But black decides it's the only chance. But where is that follow-up? So you can check here, you can check with the rook here. But you would need a pawn for e2. And white is prepared to check on d7, so black had better be careful. Can you take on e5? That grabs a pawn and it also protects d7. Yeah, simply centralize your queen, play pawn at d6, and this should be over. Pawn d6, don't forget you have another queen in your hand. And mariorton loses on time. But let's have a quick look at this position here. This is not so clear. Knight d5 was a lot better here. And indeed, queen takes f1 looks strong. But apparently rook d1 was better. Not sure why. So, yeah. This is what I mentioned. Knight takes e5. It picks up a pawn. But why doesn't it work? When you make the move, suddenly it's bad. Okay, apparently queen at b5 is the move to play. Yeah, very murky position here. But I think knight takes e5 was the way to go anyway, regardless of what the computer says. So let's get back to this game. A lot of things have happened. So a more conventional d4, d5, very symmetrical opening. Black sacrificing a piece for a pawn. He should not have full compensation here, I think. It's way too chess-like, this position, for black to have full compensation. But now, white blundered back a piece. And material is equal, but I prefer the black position now. Black has better cover for his king, I would say. And also, when you compare the pieces here, these bishops are doing a better job than these passive knights. So once again, the players are occupying their first 4 ranks. Just the occasional jab, making it across the 4th rank. Black needs to be a bit careful here, so white can't make use of this pin. Maybe you should connect the rooks. So you don't have to worry about moves like b4. But still b4 looks okay, I guess. Black is having some sort of idea here, but to be quite frank, I don't really see it. Is it knight e5? This is an excellent centralization, and Black should just hurry up and put his pieces on the board now, whereas Black should do everything in his power to prevent them from landing on the board. So Black should keep a pawn for e7, I think. And pawn e7 now is probably the way to go, with strong threats on the last rank. See, just picking up a rook there for nothing. And you could maybe check here and take on g6 with check. Taking on d2 was a bad idea because of knight f1, forking king and queen. Thank you so much, King Crusher, for raiding me. Welcome everybody, we're watching the Crazy House World Championship Candidates. Variants only, playing mariorton. This is one of the last matches of this tournament. So if we just take a quick look here, the Crazy House World Championship, Katask will face Yasugi 99 later this year for the world title. Do you mean in this position, taking on b4? Well, Black could still just grab the pawn here, maybe. Or should he just take on e4? Huge problem here, as I mentioned. Queen takes d2, knight f1, check, picking up the queen. And maybe it's time to take that pawn on b4. That was a very strange decision, and surely the black king is not safe here. Queen takes f7 was mate in 1. And if mariorton doesn't do something very odd here, he will win this game. Black hardly has a check in this position. Not the most effective way to mate, but it's mate in the next move. So finally mariorton wins the game. 4-1 at half time. So we see a completely different opening. mariorton switching to e5, and we see a theoretical duel here. The temporary piece sacrifice. And I wonder about this. Should you put the rook in the corner just to make sure the king doesn't go back? Maybe. Rook h8. Because the king is definitely safer here in the corner. White wants to trade a pawn. For obvious reasons, black is weak on the light squares. And the black king is on f7, so why not trade some pieces and open up the position? And apparently this is new to mariorton. Seems rather very natural to play d4. Maybe just put a pawn here on e6. This is a good bishop defending f2, so black doesn't have any any smothered mate tricks. Starting with knight h3. An interesting move, putting pressure here on the black pawns. And the unsafe black king should give white the advantage here. Well, simply take on e5, I'd say. Surely that is the idea. And white just keeps hammering on those black pawns. If black takes on e4, maybe queen f7 is strong, threatening the bishop on e7 and threatening mate on e8 with the rook. So, what do you capture here? Do you take on e7 maybe? I'm thinking king takes and then a bishop on g5, just pinning this knight. And you want to, yeah, he's pinning the knight. He wants to capture on f6 and then check maybe from g8 or d5. The smart thing about this is that you can put the other bishop on g5, increasing the pressure here. So bishop takes f6 followed by knight g8 check or knight d5 check. Black can cover d5, but he cannot cover g8 at the same time. Funny looking move is queen h8, threatening rook e7. White decides it's safe to let the king into the corner. This is threatening mate on h8. Now you can simply take here, can't you? Okay, or take on e8. Well, there was probably nothing for black anyway. Too many threats there in the end. Strong attack by VariantsOnly, who's leading 5-1. So another setup here by mariorton. A very interesting setup. A lot of pawns here in the center. The h file got open, so h7 is actually hanging at the moment. Although you have to be careful so you don't take with the rook, and rook takes and bishop takes, because then black has the rook at h1 check, picking up the bishop. White wants to keep this bishop on d3, so he protects the b4 square. I don't quite like the f4 move, because Look at these knights. All right, where are these guys going? Maybe this guy will land on e5, but it will take a while, and I'm not even sure it's good when it arrives there. So, what was the plan here? You trap the light square bishop, so you get back the material. But on the other hand, white could take and put a pawn on e5 maybe. So pawn e5 seems natural enough. And now I'm starting to like white, actually. Black is cramped, and white has a lot of plans to choose from. I'm not sure though why he chose to capture with... Why didn't he capture with a d pawn instead? What was wrong with d takes e5 here? So kind of awkward to protect the g7 pawn here. Black decides to just abandon the king side and flee to the queen side. It does take a while to pick up this pawn. A very interesting short castle here by white, but I think he's right. These knights are taking care of the king side. At the moment, and maybe white can open the position here somehow. Taking on d5 could be a threat. And now simply b5 maybe. Start putting pressure here on the c5. So nice pressure here, the c7 pawn. Maybe you take on c7. And then another pawn here on d6. Yeah, grabbing c7 very much makes sense here. Probably bishop d6 to save the pawn for the 7th rank. I like bishop d6 better than this. Maybe bishop a5, wanting to pick up that rook. And white has another chance here to play bishop at a5. So what's this? If white takes here, black takes on c5. He wants a knight for f2, but is this even a threat? Let's say knight at f2, rook takes, knight takes, king takes here, knight back, king h1. Is it mate? But white decides to just cover these squares. Maybe e6 here, yeah. You have queen at c7 or d7. So if this rook leaves, you have queen at b8. But it's not. Yeah, it's mate. Okay. So rook b8 ends this game. Nice win there by mariorton, 5-2. And yet another opening by mariorton. Seems like improvisation. White gains a quick lead in development, putting the queen on the semi-open e-file, forcing black to show his hand. Black has placed all his pieces, whereas white has both a knight and a pawn in hand. Protecting the d4 pawn that was hanging because of the pin here. It looks like white has a very easy to play position here. Maybe just put his rooks in the center. He might consider grabbing some space by putting a pawn on e5. White just trying to make use of that extra space here. Probably wise by black to keep his king in the center. Hi there, Fat Bin Peck, opener and draft. What kind of game are you challenging me to? So c2 is hanging, but And also if you play rook d2, black might take with the knight, and rook takes and pawn d3. So white should just probably leave the c2 pawn here and go for the attack if black decides to take here. And why shouldn't black take on c2? Is d6 something to worry about? Maybe it is, but you picked up a pawn here. Just take here with check. And can't you take on g6 as well? Slightly puzzled here. Why didn't black take on g6? So let's have a quick piece cut here. White has sacrificed a few pawns, but the black position looks a bit shaky. For instance, pawn takes here, you can take here, maybe play e6 and put a knight on e5 with an ongoing attack. Also, white has stuff like moving his bishop and having a discovered check. So do you take on e7? Sure looks very tempting. Very strong attack here for white. I don't see a defense for black. White could just take on g7 in the next move if black does nothing. Let's say take on g7, rook takes here. Take on h8 and the knight is pinned. Taking on e7 is another problem for black. So you could always take back with the bishop if you like, but now probably stronger moves. Yeah, now you're threatening queen at e7 mate because of the pin here. Still an interesting position here, I'd say. White could take on f3, but that takes a while. So this opens up some possibilities. Rather than letting white put his knight with a threat here on the queen, black steps away. And he has some pawns in hand that could harm white here on the 7th rank. Both players very low on time now. Seems like black messed this up completely. Mate is coming on f7. That was a close one. I wonder if black was doing okay near the end. Somewhere. I was thinking, why didn't black take on f7 here? Yeah. Oh, on g6. F takes g6. Looks very good for black. Okay. Back to the game. And VariantsOnly playing his famous a5, rook a6 opening. And not being afraid that white will take on g6 because that will only open the h5. And rooks and light pieces are worth about the same in this game. Oh, thank you so much, King Crusher, for rating. Very nice. Thanks for pointing that out. Okay. And I think black is probably doing just fine here. If the queen takes here, maybe you can simply check here. King takes here. You have a fork on g4. Well, I don't know. Checking on e1 is a threat that white needs to address. Nifty little check here, and white doesn't have anything but knights and rooks to interpose with. So maybe you can take here and play knight h5 and make use of another knight on g3. So black simply protected his f2 pawn. He has moves like knight g1 check or knight c2 with threats against the rook and the pawn on d4. Very hard for white to do anything with his rooks. Yeah, this is a nice move. You simply want to, well, you threaten the rook, but you want to capture the pawn maybe. Or take d2. Because checks on this diagonal look very dangerous now. Maybe you take on d4. The white king is very restricted here. Black can maybe check on b3 with the pawn if white is not careful, or simply mate on b2. That was a cheap little trick. VariantsOnly is full of them and good at them. Okay, 7-2. And this is the last game. Congratulations to VariantsOnly for winning this. So I'm not sure if white can keep the tension here any longer. Well, this is certainly a way to do it. But what about e5 now? This is not a good square for this knight in this position. He will most likely get trapped. Maybe black was hoping to play knight takes d4 and then take on e5, but in a position like that, I would probably have just castled instead of playing h3. But this wants some material for white, and material is always nice. Does black have any kind of compensation here? I very much doubt it. White only needs a few more moves. Just go back with his king, and he can afford to play some aggressive moves as well. Now this is nice. Knight and pawn and rook participating in the attack. White is just building up his attack. And okay, you're probably right, this looks lost for black already. A complete disaster for black, who simply resigns. 8-2, VariantsOnly. GG's. And see you soon, guys. Are there any more matches that are scheduled? I don't see anything after VariantsOnly versus mariorton, but there are a few more games left. So I will probably be back. Take care, and I will see if I can find someone to raid myself. Let's see how to do this. Hikaru, he can have some of my viewers, but let's make him happy. There you go. Bye bye everybody. Take care.